Hello, this is Angelica Yingst, and you're listening to Centered, grounded conversations about the metaphysical. Hello, welcome to Centered. It's Angelica Yingst, and I'm here with another episode of Centered, and this one's just a Q&A episode. I shouldn't say just, because we're covering some of my favorite topics, which is philosophy and theology, and I love the questions we received. So I just want to start this out by saying it's pretty dense research and a lot of scholarly talk. And so I just want to kind of preface it by saying that I'm speaking as a researcher rather than as a believer. So we're going to talk about Christianity a little bit. And so if you're a Christian, you may want to skip it. If you're like a scriptural literalist, it's definitely not taking that approach. It's talking about the history, when things were written, why they were written, and that kind of agenda talk can sometimes bother Christians, so I just want you to know. I also really want to plug something I'm doing, which is the first weekend of October. I am part of Spirit of Oneness, which is hosted by my beautiful bestie Sharon Muzio. It is at the Scottish Rite Theater in Harrisburg. It's on 3rd Street, I believe, and Division. It's right by the Zembo Shrine. So if you've ever been downtown in Harrisburg, it is absolutely beautiful in there. There's 2 floors of holistic healers, readers, things for sale. I always stock up on everything while I'm there. But I'm actually going to be selling crystals. I've been creating different jewelry and tools and spell kits and things that come from my heart that I use on the daily basis. So just inviting you to come. My books are going to be for sale. Sharon did her 2025 affirmation book, which is just amazing. She also did a deck of affirmation cards based on her book. She's just amazing with doing this stuff. And she actually is a tarot reader and a very good tarot reader. So anyway, she's not offering tarot readings, but my friend John Tucker is, and Lee Ann, and there's so many people that I love when we go there, and there's workshops that you go for free, and you can go the whole weekend. It's Saturday and Sunday, 10 to 6 on Saturday and 10 to 5 on Sunday. And I'm plugging it because it's awesome. I would love to give you a hug in person. Because I'm not offering sessions, I'm a little more free to talk to people and hug people. And really, if you want crystals, I've got a lot. I think I have 81 different tumbled stones that I'm bringing, and lots of specimen pieces, lots of spheres and towers and carvings. I do a lot of animal medicine, and I'm always happy to put together a medicine bundle for you, for example. So that's my advertisement. Come to Spirit of Oneness, and I know you're gonna love it there. There's food. Everything's kind of self-contained, and you can come and go if you sign in. There's going to be yoga and dancing, and my giant wings that I painted are going to be there. So I just hope to see you there. I think you'll love it, and that's the reason I'm sharing it. I don't usually do advertisements or anything, but it's really to share this information because I think it's the most amazing event, has the best vibes, and it's just I love it. I literally love, there's not one person that I avoid there. I'm I love everyone. I talk to everyone. I go Thursday morning and I start helping with all the stuff. And I leave on Sunday night. Basically, I tell the kids and my husband, sorry, I'm not seeing you all weekend. Just imagine that I'm out of town. I should go at it. I should just stay in a hotel or something. Do a sleepover. But anyway, so I hope you enjoy this episode. I have 2 questions, and I'll try to break them up and put them in the show notes, where they are in relation to the entire episode, if you're interested. Okay, enjoy. Our first question comes from Becky Davis, ACM, meaning she's an advanced crystal master, by the way. Her question is, how do we find meaning when our day-to-day lives feel empty? Exhale. When I read this, I had that echo of a feeling that I had so long and often, And sometimes I still have it here and there, but it was like that feeling of being stuck in a loop, especially when I worked minimum wage jobs and was occasionally homeless, and at the very least too poor to be able to break out of that poverty cycle and feel like I was just living paycheck to paycheck. And I often would have like $3 in my pocket and that's it for 4 days. You know what I mean? And I had that existential dread of like, oh my God, this is life, like forever. And then even when I would, be a little more secure, I would just be in that loop of like, wake up, drink coffee, get shower, go to work, come home, eat a can of tuna, drink a bottle of wine, pass out, rinse and repeat. So, I kind of felt like I was burnt out from life, and sort of like I was still like an arm's throw away from birth. I was so young, but I would just kind of lie on my futon couch and moan like in Harry Met Sally. What are you going to do tonight? I think I'm just going to moan. Anyway, it's like the myth of Sisyphus, the pointless, absurdist existence that has come to define some of the most interesting thoughts about life, the universe, and everything. So one of my favorite philosophers, Albert Camus, he kind of came out of that philosophical school of existentialism, wrote an entire philosophical treatise on Sisyphus. I actually wrote my high school senior term paper on 3 of Camus' books. It was about 30 pages long. It was on the stranger, the myth of Sisyphus, and the plague. And, I just have to say that I break into a lot of ADHD kind of sidebars, so I apologize. But for those of you who don't know the myth of Sisyphus, let me summarize, because I'm always bringing it back to the Greeks. So Sisyphus is mentioned in Homer's Iliad, book 6. In the post Homer times, Sisyphus was called the father of Odysseus. Okay. And Sisyphus was the founder of the Isthmian Games. So that was a festival of athletics, kind of like the Olympics. But it honored the sea god Poseidon. And then later, this is how the myth goes. So death comes for Sisyphus, and somehow Sisyphus tricked death and chained him up. And when he did that, his idea was no one could die. So then finally Ares comes to aid death, and Sisyphus has to submit to death. In the meantime, Sisyphus had told his wife, Merope, not to perform the usual sacrifices and then leave his body unburied. Why? Because when you reach the underworld and you're unburied, you can't go into the underworld. It's sort of the ideas, the death ideas. So then he was trying to trick death again. So the idea was that, if you are not buried by your family, then you go back and haunt them, right? And you punish them for not burying you. But once he was home, Sisyphus was like, let's just continue living. And so he lived very old and then died a second time. Okay. So finally, when Sisyphus dies, and he's a lot like Prometheus, trying to, beat death, trying to trick the gods, they're the tricksters, the thieves, those kind of things. But they're trying to help humanity, right? So the punishment of Sisyphus was that he was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill in the underworld, and when the boulder got to the top, it rolled back down. So before he could reach the top, it always failed. So he's, Sisyphus is punished this way. So all for the rest of eternity, he's rolling this boulder up and it's going back down. So one of the things about Sisyphus is that, his punishment sort of became the symbol of the absurd nature of human existence, right? The term Sisyphean is used to describe tasks that are laborious and futile. And so he has this punishment in Hades for cheating death and, or trying to cheat death. But, what we can do when we're thinking about how do we find meaning is we can kind of go back to some of these writings like Camus. He says about this myth, yes, it's meaningless. Like who among us hasn't felt that feeling of rolling a huge boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down and then doing it all over again? Laundry, I'm looking at you. Dishes, you can't hide from this one, but you can list anything, right? Garbage, work, diapers, if you're a parent, it's a rock going up a hill and it rolls back down. Now, Camus kind of writes an entire treatise about this and basically says, this is one of his quotes: "Man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the reasonable silence of the world." And he's talking about the human need for meaning. So he said the struggle itself towards height is the meaning. It's enough to fill a man's heart. And he says, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. How the hell do you get there? Well, that's a discussion. When we talk about existentialism, what we were really talking about is how do we make meaning out of a meaningless thing, So, and I want to say that Camus converge on nihilism, and I want to kind of distinguish the two of them. So existentialism and nihilism are both philosophical perspectives that address the meaning of life, but they differ in their approaches. So nihilism believes that life is meaningless and nothing can be known or communicated. Okay? It rejects values, the valuation society places on people, for example. That's what makes it kind of scary. There's this sort of like no meaning. People have no value. Nothing has value. The possibility of knowledge or communication, it's rejected. So nihilism is associated with sort of pessimism and radical skepticism. Okay? It is an atheistic approach, and so is existentialism for the most part, though there are many Christian existentialists that kind of, I don't know if they'd call themselves that, but they kind of come out of that school, or they started that school. Existentialism believes that life is meaningless, but that meaning can be created by the individual. Existentialism is based on the assumption that humans have free will and can create meaning in their lives by establishing values and acting in accordance with them. So, we're talking about existentialism, and, in a lot of ways, existentialism saved my life as a depressed teenager, with suicidal ideation. It gave me this freedom to establish my values and live in accordance with them. I was reading Camus in 9th grade, Being a Nothingness in 10th grade, Kierkegaard in 11th grade. I was knee deep in philosophical thought and existentialism. So you hit one of my special interests, Becky. Congratulations. You will forever be deeply loved by me. So that is to say, I love your question because I relate to it, and I'm not sure this is a universal experience of life. I don't know if the majority of people feel life is empty on a day-to-day basis. But I would assume that probably everyone has had a period of time when the world just stopped making sense. And that can happen out of nowhere for no apparent reason. And sometimes it can happen because of something that happens in your life. But, when we wake up sort of like in the middle of that, the familiar is strange. We're in the middle of it. It feels like we're in the middle of the dream and we're like, why am I doing this? Where is this all headed? What's the point of this? This isn't some like abstract philosophical bullshit thought. What we're really asking are questions that everyone should ask at some point. It's what intelligent people do. They say, why am I doing this? And I think, Albert Einstein said something like, it's important to never stop questioning. I forget what the quote is, but the idea is that once we start questioning, why am I doing this? Right? Experiences of emptiness and meaninglessness can be difficult, but treating it like it's a flu or a virus or a symptom of depression or a horrible existence or suicidal thoughts, that's pathologizing healthy, intelligent questioning. Existential crises bring you questions that should be explored. Now, I have to say there is like a sense of meaninglessness of life or emptiness of life that can indicate burnout, overwhelm, depression, difficult life circumstances, that's also normal human experience. When we have depression teaming up with nihilism, you can kind of have that false feeling that you've uncovered some brutal truth about life, and, that like it just can get you really depressed. So I think when we focus sort of on, okay, I'm in this existentialist place, when life is happening, we lose a job, a relationship, we struggle with money, work is monotonous, we get that swarm of questions. Why am I doing this? Should I just get an RV and travel the world? We distinguish it from ordinary depression because of the situation, right? Or because, we are motivated to find meaning. Okay. Sometimes we call this an existential crisis. What am I doing with my life? Or we're racked with ennui or crippling ennui. It's that dread and boredom of living life. It can be unsettling, confusing, disorienting, can even be disheartening, but it can be the beginning of a powerful shift of energy. So I think the question is there a real no-nonsense answer to the meaning of life that can make sense to us on a daily basis? How do we move from emptiness to fullness, or meaninglessness to meaning, especially when we experience life as being like monotonous or empty or whatever? And so here's a great quote from Camus that I actually wrote down. It says, "Whether the earth or sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is an excellent reason for dying as well. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions." And so I think what's the point, but actually the most perceptive and sensitive question that we can have on the actual condition of things. So welcome to Existentialism. I'm your tour guide, Angelica. We're on a blindingly odd journey through the weirdos of the philosophy world. And I have to tell you that existentialism, like I said, kind of saved my life. But it came to me through The Cure, which has a song called Killing an Arab. Not the best title. It is now sort of exiled to the quote unquote, it was a different time closet. But it is actually about The Stranger, which is about a guy whose mother dies. He feels nothing. He's totally cut off. He sees that life is meaningless because of death. Death kind of is there. And he's walking, and I forget how it happens, but he comes onto he's in Algeria, where he's from, and he's walking on the beach, and he shoots an Arab who dies. And he goes to trial. He's basically in prison. And it's in prison that he starts realizing the absurdity of what he's done, and what has happened. Like, he finally feels something free, like a freedom, because he got condemned basically because he didn't feel anything. And so it's a very small book. It's great though. I mean, existentialism basically explores that human condition and the meaning of existence. So it's characterized by these things: individual responsibility. So they believe that people are responsible for their own actions and choices and must create meaning in their life. It's also free will. So existentialists believe that people have free will, so they're able to determine their life. So they don't have this idea of God's will. They don't have an idea of this divine plan. They are constantly creating like a kind of meaning for themselves. They also focus on the absurdity of human existence, the idea that we persist and we continue trying to progress when we see very little progress. Alienation, they believe that humans are alienated from one another, can never really understand another person's perspective. And they have a critique to mass society or conformity. And the idea is that, all these people are doing the same thing and it's not changing anything, right? So basically the first rule of existentialism is there's no rule. There's no God, basically, for the most part. And if God exists, he's not involved. So think more deist rather than theist. Okay. And if you know what those mean, deist basically means that God created the universe, but just lets humans do their own thing. whereas theists think there's a God, there's God's plan. Okay. So small, insignificant humans with no design for living, no God's plan, no nothing. So what's the point? And existentialists say, exactly, what is your point for living? So it boils down a few key ideas. First off, it's your life. It's not my life, it's your life. So there's a lot of like live and let live kind of ideas. Now, one of the big questions in existentialism is, what does it mean to exist? What is the I in the I am? So who am I? And so basically it's saying like, okay, life throws us all these options. So are we as individuals just a conglomeration of our choices? So there's always like this context that we're talking about. Now, existentialism kind of clashes with my idea. I am someone who is maybe deistic, but I also feel like the interconnectedness of all things brings my life meaning. That we're all connected, and that's been really important for me to create meaning. And what does that mean? It means that I don't see animals contemplating their existence too often. And why? Because they're existing. Existentialism does not exist in this like scientific, there isn't this like cold hard facts idea. It's also not for objectivism. It's basically about possibilities and choices, and against the idea that life is predetermined. But it also doesn't align with solipsism, which is basically the idea that only I exist, or the reality is just in our mind. But it emphasizes that we exist in relation to each other, and that there is a kind of transcendence in existing without meaning. Okay. Now, for me, like I said, I think one of the wonderful things that I learned in my studies, my shamanic studies, is that my teacher kind of had us write and think about the myth of separation. And her idea was, we have this false idea that we're separate from nature and earth, or we're separate from each other, or we're separate from the universe. And that keeps us stuck in that feeling of insignificance, like kind of being overwhelmed by the vastness of the universe, which happens to me a lot, or the vastness of people. So it's overwhelming to kind of confront all that you don't know or can't comprehend, and then pair that with the fear of death, and then that becomes the emptiness, right? There's no objective meaning. But, for me, when I think about the interconnectedness and the idea that we are all one, that helps me have meaning. Like, I don't know how interconnected I am with everybody. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know how I may help one of the animals that I see on my day-to-day life. And so because I don't know the interconnectedness and how we feed and nourish each other, separating myself also is not going to be helpful. So, there is sort of a therapeutic part of existentialism that helps us break free from the day-to-day grind and directs us to living an authentic life, one that's grounded in relationships with others, grounded in relationships with the world, So this is just such a small part, just so much to explore with existentialism. But I do think that one of the things that existentialism is good at is saying, like, life is like a Rorschach ink blot. Okay. And I read this on a wonderful website. I forgave it. I did not write it down, but the idea is like, does that ink blot have meaning? If you just see a piece of paper with an ink block, you go, no, that it doesn't have meaning. It's just a blot. Someone put paint on, shut it. There's nothing inherently meaningful about it. The idea is when you look into it, you see whatever you need to see, right? Everyone brings their own interpretation, and whatever you see is 100% valid. Not because it reveals a truth about the ink blot, but because it reflects you. It reflects your perspective. It reflects everything you've been through and everything that you think about the world. So if you believe the universe lacks meaning, you're right. It might. But also what you're seeing in life is the meaning. So you're not really missing a meaning of life, but the motivation. What makes life worth living? So, part of what I do in my work is, life coaching and stuff like that. And, it's about, for me, it's about asking questions like, how do we break out of this? How do we open our mind? How do we live in awe and wonder and curiosity and gratitude? How do we embrace the mystery? What gets us excited? So how, instead of thinking about the emptiness of life, thinking about the motivation, what will motivate me to bring in the stuff that will give me meaning, right? The universe is vast and wild and chaotic, and we're here to witness it and make sense of it in our own way. It is the ink blot. So what does it mean to you? So it's not foolish or delusional to find joy, wonder, and fulfillment in the small things. Like, you wouldn't even believe how excited I get about a cup of coffee. But even if it seems insignificant compared to the size of the universe, it's not really about the universe. It's about us, right? And our relation. So saying life is meaningless sort of is like saying the ink blot is meaningless. It is. But we have to also look at the ink blot and figure out what it means for us. Okay. So it's about the experience, the journey, the moment, the presence. I find Buddhism to have a really nice structure if you are into, finding some philosophical ideas that help us break out of that feeling of emptiness. Buddhism, if you go the Zen route, it embraces that. It wants you to move into that emptiness, into the smallness you might feel, to kind of understand our place is small and powerful. Okay, so opening your mind to different approaches can be helpful. So if you are interested in existentialism, there are some works that can be helpful to read. Literary works like No Exit is a play by Jean-Paul Sartre. Waiting for Godot is by Samuel Beckett, the Irish playwright. The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus, or The Stranger. There's Dostoevsky. There's Tolstoy. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, they're not considered existentialism, but they kind of precede that. So they have some of that. Kafka, there's some great films. Like, I took a class on existentialism in college it was called Themes in Existentialism. It was so good. That class was so good. We watched movies about existentialism, like that had existentialist themes. So we watched, again, another closet labeled canceled. We watched Hannah and Her Sisters, which is a Woody Allen movie. I think we watched another Woody Allen movie that was more like film noir-ish. We watched Popeye. We watched The Seventh Seal. We watched Being There, which is with Peter Sellers. That was a really good one for thinking about existentialism and existing. We watched a Kurosawa, and I think it's Ikaru. I hope that helped. I am a huge fan of talking about the meaning of life, so thank you for the opportunity. My next question is from Lee Ann Huebner, and she said, "This is something I've been meaning to research forever. When did the quote in the Bible from Jesus saying he was the only way to God first show up? Because I'm not buying it. One, it doesn't seem like something he would say. And two, why would God exclude much of the human souls on this planet with a one-line quote?" These are great questions. And I think, like, in the question or comments, in the question itself, you have a really important statement of fact for biblical scholars, which is, when did this idea come to be? And next is, that we ask is, why did it come to be? So just a quick disclaimer again for Christians. This is a scholarly exploration of biblical topics and theology. So I'm not speaking as a Christian. I'm not saying I'm a Christian, but I am someone who has studied religion. I have my degree in religion. I've studied the Old and New Testaments in depth. I've studied the archaeology of the Old and New Testament, and I believe that it's possible to date the writings of the Bible and sometimes discover who wrote them and why. So if you're a scriptural literalist, that's what some people call fundamentalists, which is wrong. By the way, thank you, David Watt, my professor, for that one. But a scriptural literalist is someone who believes the Bible was written by God and every word in it is true and literal. So while that is something that, I'm not going to argue with, this Q&A segment is not that, okay? So I'll be dispelling myths and discussing the different gospels in the New Testament, and I'm going to get that out of the way. So, Lee Ann, to answer your question, when did the quote from the Bible of Jesus saying he was the only way to God first show up? Well, I blame John, but, I think what you're referring to as the most quoted of these lines is probably the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 6, which is the quote, "I am the way, I am the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And then another famous one, which everybody holds up at games, John 3:16, which is, "For God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." That goes on, 17 and 18, to say, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of our only Son of God." Okay, so John goes on. There's many more in John saying essentially the same thing. Like, if you don't believe in God, you're going to suffer forever. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about the Gospels. So there are 4 canonical Gospels in the New Testament. So gospel means good news. They're basically the good news of salvations that Christians are proclaiming. And honestly, there are a lot more Gospels than 4, and they've just been left out of the canon. But that's a whole other subject altogether. The Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the order they're presented in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. They started being called that, I think, in like the 18th century, because they cover the same events in Jesus's life. Most of them are about Jesus's ministry in Galilee, and a lot of it is in the same order. So nearly 90% of Mark's content is found in Matthew, and about 50% of Mark appears in Luke. That's because Mark is the oldest. Okay, so all of the parables of Christ are found in the Synoptics. The Gospel of John contains no parables. All right. The Gospel according to John also has like kind of a different arrangement, and it does have a different perspective on Christ. So this is the important part. Who wrote it and why? Because when you figure out the why part, then you understand why John says this over and over again. So let's talk about the first Gospel, which is Matthew, which is supposedly written by, and we can't prove it was or wasn't written by who they say it's written by. But we do know there's oral tradition in all the religions in the Mediterranean and Middle East. So these stories were probably passed down. One of the things that we do know from some of the communities in the Palestine area was that, they found scrolls of the same thing written over and over again. So they would have scribes rewriting stories. Okay, so if there were stories of, the Bibles were rewritten by hand, there's no printing press, right? So that's what the Dead Sea Scrolls are. They're writings from the Essenes, from the Gnostic communities. And so we know that they were rewritten over and over again. So that it's pretty normal to have the stories saying the same thing from different perspectives, right? Because who you are depends on how you're going to interpret and tell a story, okay? So the Gospel of Matthew was written by St. Matthew, the evangelist, one of the 12 apostles. He is described in the text in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, as a tax collector. He composed that in Greek, meaning he was, writing in a language of the state. Okay. So we know that the Romans occupied the area of Palestine for, a long time, right? So Jews were persecuted, Christians were persecuted. Okay. And that becomes more important in John. Okay. So really, we think it's written around 90 CE. So if Jesus is born 90 CE is, 60, 70 years after Jesus died. So in the sequence of historical writing, this is not the earliest. Like I said, Mark is, but there are definitely indications that Matthew was writing for a Jewish audience. Okay. And why? Because he starts with all the begats, right? He starts by saying Jesus was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. He shows a direct lineage from David, King David. And that you could not be the king of the Jews, so to speak, if you were not in the lineage of King David. Okay? Which is when he gets baptized by John the Baptist, this is the anointing on the head that happened with the Jewish kings, right? So he's considered the most Jewish gospel. He's trying to convert or preach to Jews. So everything he's writing, albeit they were educated Jews because they wrote in Greek, but we also see the virgin birth in Luke and Matthew, which was a common theme in the cults and religions of the Mediterranean. A god comes down as a golden light and impregnates a human woman, and she gives birth to a hero, half man, half god. Okay? That idea is something that is very prevalent in the religions that are in that area. Okay? So that's something that Matthew and Luke both talk about. Okay? So, the Gospel of Mark does not talk about birth at all of Jesus. He starts at the anointing of Jesus, the baptism of Jesus from John. Okay, John the Baptist. The Gospel of Mark is the oldest of the Gospels. So Mark is attributed to St. Mark the Evangelist. He was an associate of St. Paul, a disciple of St. Peter, whose teachings the Gospel may reflect. Okay? It is the shortest. It's the earliest of the Gospels. Many of the scholars agree that Matthew and Luke probably composed a lot of their accounts from Mark, which existed before their Gospels existed. Okay? The text is a little more simple, a little more direct, but it is like the primary source of information about Jesus's ministry. He talks about Jewish customs. He translates Aramaic expressions. He was writing for Gentile converts, meaning people that were Roman or of a Hellenistic background. Okay, the Hellenistic religions, for example, did not practice circumcision, right? He doesn't mention circumcision at all. Peter does, but they're trying to basically say like, oh, if you weren't circumcised because you're not a Jew, that's cool. Like, you don't have to. Jesus has stopped that, right? But, because who's going to really get converted if you're like, oh, by the way, you need to cut the tip of your dick off? No one. So they're trying different approaches for different people, okay? They're writing for different people. I'm going to keep saying that probably, and it's going to get annoying. But, there's, Mark's gospel stresses the deeds, the strength, the determination of Jesus in overcoming evil forces and defying the power of imperial Rome. That really comes in the last few verses, which looks like they were tacked on by someone else later. Why? Again, the Christians were persecuted. Okay. So they're trying to say this is a prophecy, right? That's like, when we talk about Revelation was written, it makes it sound like it's a prediction, but what it really is doing is telling what's happening and then attributing it to being written hundreds of years earlier so that people believe this is a prediction from God that the the Romans are going to be persecuted. Right. All right. That's a sidebar. I shouldn't talk about that. Okay. Gospel of Luke is credited to St. Luke, who is the beloved physician and associate with St. Paul the Apostle. Now, Luke's gospel is clearly written for Gentiles. Okay. It traces Christ's genealogy back to Adam rather than back to David. Why? Because he's the father of the human race rather than the father than Abraham, right? The father of the Jewish people. So again, Matthew and Luke are written about the same time, 90 CE, whereas Mark is like 70 CE. We know that it's before 70, that Mark is written before 70 because it precedes the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay. So Luke really is kind of talking about like the other synoptic gospels, talking about the details of Jesus's ministry, but also talking about his infancy, which none of the other ones do, his journey to Bethlehem, his miracles. I mean, they all mention his miracles, but the age 12 at the temple, talking to the doctors of law, these are kind of the things that the hallmarks of Luke's gospel. Lots of healing because he was a healer. Also talking about the ascension, which isn't in the other gospels. Now, all that is to say, he's also converting people that are Gentiles. And you can hear, there's two Gentile gospels, and then there's a Jewish gospel, and now we're at John. So John contrasts the synoptic gospels wildly at his perspective. Now, John is seen to be written somewhere between 100 CE and 200 CE. And I was taught that this gospel comes from a long line of traditional philosophical writings around Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. Okay, so all of the words in John are translated in ways that would not exactly, they're not exactly translatable in the same way. Why? Because they're loaded terms. They're Neoplatonic terms. They're Gnostic terms. So when you say the word, Jesus is the word, Jesus is the, that means something for Neoplatonists. Okay. So although this gospel is written by St. John the apostle of Jesus, obviously there's considerable discussion about the actual identity of the author. The language of the gospel and its well-developed theology, okay, and I'm going to say that the earlier gospels, they're still 50, 60 years after Jesus died, right? Now, when we're looking at St. John, the gospel according to John, we're looking at 100, 200 years after. So the theology of Christianity has become more formed, okay? There is an idea here. They are developing a theology that John is trying to set forward. So we think of this as the most spiritual of the gospels because it has a more developed theology. Okay. So, there are some episodes of Jesus's life that we can correspond with the synoptic gospels, but, it's different in a lot of ways. It really does talk about the church and like this mystical aspect of Jesus being the Son of God. He owns that in John. He says basically, I am God, and he does not say that in the other gospels in the same way. So, John is constantly kind of adding interpretive comments to clarify Jesus and Jesus's motives because he's trying to convert people, right, into a religion, not following Jesus, but following a religion. It's a little different. So, the fact that he says he is the Son of God, which is not something we see in the other ones as overtly, it's more hiding that fact, right? Because of this, it has a different agenda, right? Now, what is the agenda? Well, Christians were persecuted people. The first Christian emperor doesn't come around. That's Constantine the Great. Doesn't come around till 300 CE, 330, 37 or whatever. He reigned 305, 306 to 337 CE. So his role was to spread Christianity. But before that, the Christians were beheaded, persecuted. So Christians wanted numbers. The larger they were, the more protected they were. Okay. So when Constantine converted to Christianity, it really marked a turning point for the Roman Empire. Christianity transitioned from being a persecuted religion to the dominant religion. So you can see in John's gospel, what he's really saying is, only we get to have heaven. Join us. We have eternal life with peaceful and loving God, but only if you accept God, Jesus Christ, as the Son of God. That's it. So fear has always been a motivator of conversion to people's ideas. But here's what I really want to say, and this is the part that transcends all these gospels. Even though Jesus' ministry was small, largely Jewish, he still interacted with people from different cultures and backgrounds, many of whom followed their own religious tradition. And I can't kind of state that enough. If you look and read the Gospels, Jesus had conversations with Romans who came from polytheistic background, Syrians and Canaanites who were idol worshippers, Samaritans who were somewhat Jewish but had their own practices. I mean, there's still Samaritans out there. The Gospels capture all these different interactions. The Roman centurion with his sick servant, the Roman governor Pilate, the Canaanite woman whose daughter was ill, the lepers, the Samaritan woman at the well. They probably weren't Jewish, and yet Jesus's approach to them was different. He didn't engage with them the same way he did with the disciples. And you might want to say, oh, he did not accept them. No, this is how he actually treated them. In his encounters, he didn't push his agenda. Instead, he healed the sick. He helped those suffering with oppression. He encouraged people to share their experiences of healing. He praised people for their own faith. He pointed to them as examples of goodness. He claimed they would enjoy a place in heaven. So when we're kind of looking at all these writings, we can say, Jesus only revealed himself as the King of the Jews or the Messiah when he was directly asked. What's more striking is what he didn't do, I think you can say, which is that he didn't follow social prejudices of his own culture, which were existent. As part of what he got so angry about was the ways that the Jews were basically condemning other people, including their own, of not being good enough or whatever. He didn't condemn or rebuke foreigners. He didn't warn them of judgment. He didn't say you can't get to heaven. In fact, he didn't engage them in theological debates at all. He didn't quote himself. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't change them. He didn't convert them. He loved them. He highlighted their good. He answered the questions they were actually asking. He wasn't doing what John says he was doing in the other Gospels. So this non-judgment, compassionate approach is something that feels really important to be highlighting right now. And I love that you asked this question because, when did it come about? Well, it came about with John, but it isn't what most of the Gospels are saying. The three other ones are basically saying, love is the way. It's completely radical. It would change the world if anybody listened to Jesus, but when we look at research, we can see how Christians and have this ideology, especially evangelical Christians, that have pushed people away and they feel less safe with Christians, right? So I think we need to think about what Jesus actually practiced, what he did, rather than what people who wrote about him said. He wasn't converting them. He was kind. He healed. He praised. He addressed real questions and concerns. He fed people. He washed the feet of people being stoned who were sex workers. I think that the goodness that Jesus demonstrated, the compassion, the grace, the truth, that reigns true if you read the Gospels. But it's, it starts getting lost when you get the letters and the, people talking about what Jesus wanted, because they have an agenda. So in the mortal words of Jeff Lebowski, I'm just going to say this very heretical thing about the Gospel of John. That's just like your opinion, man. Anyway, I hope that helped, Lee Ann. It's long.
Thanks for listening to Centered with me, Angie Yangst. If you'd like to send me a question or comment about this show or any shows, you can send them to Angie@themoonandstone.com.